I move that this bill now be read a second time. Mr Speaker, the Telecommunications Amendment guaranteeing mobile phone service in bushfire zones Bill 2017, which I'm introducing today, seeks to ensure vulnerable communities in high bushfire risk areas can use their mobile phones for the critical 24 hours after a blackout. This legislation would require telecommunication carriers to provide 24-hour standby power capability for mobile phone towers that operate in high-risk bushfire communities. The federal government agency, Emergency Management Australia, would be tasked with identifying high-risk bushfire communities, taking into account long-established and widely used state and territory-based mapping of bushfire risk areas. The Australian Communications and Media Authority would be responsible for determining the detail of the regulations that enforce these provisions. Mr Speaker, in just a few months' time, the bushfire danger season will start in my electorate and in most electorates in the southern half of Australia, from Perth to west to Sydney to the east. I do not want my community or others in high-risk bushfire areas to once again face the risk of zero communication with the outside world because the NBN doesn't work in a blackout and there is no legislative requirement on the telecommunication companies to ensure there is enough standby power available for mobile phone towers. In a meeting with NBN officials in my office to discuss this problem, I was told in no uncertain terms that every NBN customer, no matter the technology, could assume they will have zero access to not only the internet in a blackout but also their landline and their mobile phone. 7 months ago, in the first sitting week of the 2017 parliamentary year, I stood up in question time and asked the Prime Minister what he was going to do about the fact that for nearly 5 days in the middle of the bushfire season, thousands of my constituents had zero access to telecommunications. So let me set the scene. Just before midnight on the 27th of December last year, a major storm swept across the mid-north of South Australia and through the Mount Lofty Ranges, bringing down large trees and power lines. At one stage, 183,000 households were without power. The damage was particularly severe in the Adelaide Hills. On New Year's Eve, 4 days after the storm, 15 communities still remained without power. If you live in the metropolitan area, you might think this is just no refrigeration, no cooking or possibly no hot water. However, in parts of the hills where there is no mains water connection, no power means no water, no pumps to run bores, no rainwater tanks, no toilets, no septic sewage systems. But a particular concern to my community was the lack of telecommunications. Households with the downgraded NBN fibre-to-the-node technology lost their landline and internet service immediately. No power, no NBN. That everyone with mobile phones, they lost coverage after approximately 4 hours when batteries in local mobile phone towers ran out. Those lucky enough to have copper landlines and old-fashioned handsets had communication for about 36 hours until the battery backup at the exchanges ran out. So in the middle of the fire danger season, the only way most residents could know if a fire had in fact started in our region was to go outside and look for smoke. We have residents with mobility issues, elderly residents, residents who are quite isolated, living in hilly country where there is only one road into a community. I have the oldest electorate in South Australia. That alone brings a degree of vulnerability. This is simply not good enough. Under the NBN, I believe the high-risk bushfire communities are more vulnerable today than when the Ash Wednesday bushfires swept across South Australia and Victoria in the 1980s. Given the tragic history of major bushfires in the Mount Lofty Ranges, we were incredibly lucky a fire didn't start in that Christmas to New Year's Eve period. Community concern was such that residents organised a series of public meetings after the clean-up, inviting local leaders to attend and answer questions. I attended as the local federal member and was asked to explain what legislation existed to ensure communications were maintained during emergencies. To summarise my investigations, there are none. While telecommunications legislation imposes certain obligations on telecommunications providers, exemptions are available in the event of an emergency, such as a natural disaster or extreme weather event. For example, communication service providers are generally exempt from requirements, such as the customer service guarantee, provided they meet certain notification requirements. And there is no requirement for carriers to keep their mobile phone services operating. According to ACMA, responding to a question on notice from my colleague Senator Griff, the agency has not raised the NBN power problem as a potential issue with the Critical Infrastructure Advisory Council. The argument appears to be that the long carriers that as long as carriers warn their customers about the limitations of NBN technology, that is sufficient. My community was shocked. They wonder how it can be when telecommunications is such an integral part of our lives, such an integral part of South Australia's emergency management plan and other state and territory management plans. In South Australia, the State Emergency Management Plan forces a large part of its public communications strategy via the online platform Alert SA and emergency SMS messages. If SA Power Networks cut the power, as usually happens on a catastrophic day when fire starts, it seems that we can expect mobile phone towers will run out of battery. If it cuts in the morning, we'll run out by lunchtime. And so this bill would provide a critical window of 24 hours on a potential bushfire risk day where residents do not have access to emergency SMS messages and other information to access when they do. Again, it is simply not good enough, and my community wholeheartedly agrees. After their public meetings, they put together a report, and one of the 31 recommendations was a call for the federal government to work with carriers to ensure there was adequate backup. In introducing this bill, I am attempting to address this potentially life-threatening oversight. If we indeed are a nation of innovation, I do not think it is too much to ask telecommunication companies to provide 24-hour standby power capability to mobile phone towers that operate in high bushfire risk areas. Taxpayers have spent $600 million of their money for carriers to build or upgrade more than 760 towers across round 1 and 2 of the mobile backstop program. I think the least we can expect is 24-hour backup. This is a simple protective measure for regional communities in Australia and the high-risk bushfire areas, and I encourage the government to consider its private member's bill as a matter of urgency.